Christian Zionists. This Reverend William Heckler, a Christian Zionist, he wrote the book, The Restoration of the Jews to Palestine According to the Prophets. He was convinced that Herzl was sent by God to fulfill prophecy. The only problem, Herzl himself did not think so because Herzl was not a believing Jew. Next. All right. Well, how did, what happened to give the Jewish people legitimacy into the land of Palestine? The Jews went to the British in 1917, the very year the British controlled Palestine. And they asked the British to come up with this declaration, which we call the Belfor Declaration. Belfor was a subject of the British king. And Belfor came up with this: His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of the object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and the political status enjoyed by Jews in other countries. The Jewish folks, they took this Belfor Declaration as their Magna Carta, as their ticket to come to Palestine and start settling Palestine. Next. Belfor also was somehow a religious, what we call Christian Zionist. And he came up with this statement. He said, Zionism, be it right or wrong, good or bad, is rooted in age-long traditions, in present needs, in future hopes, of far profounder import than the desires or prejudices of the 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit that ancient land. You know what that means? It means that the 700,000 Arabs who live in Palestine, they are not that important. What is important is the profound ideas of Christian Zionism that we have in our minds and our hearts. These ideas are more important than the future of the Palestinian Arab population. You agree with him? I hope not. Next. All right. Encouraged by the Belfor Declaration, the Zionists drew this map and submitted to the British government and said to the British government, this is what we want. We want Palestine to be all over this. I mean, not Palestine, the state of Israel. We want the state of Israel to be all in the red. This includes all Mandate Palestine, plus part of Transjordan, plus part of Syria and Lebanon. The British said, sorry, we cannot give you this because most of the population is Arabs, whether Palestinian Arabs, Jordanian Arabs, Syrian Arabs, or Lebanese Arabs. Next. Yet, again, encouraged by the Belfor Declaration, Jews from around the world start coming and creating Jewish settlements in Mandate Palestine. By 1936, the Palestinians had enough. They felt like their country is slipping away from them. And so they decided to revolt. This is called Intifada. The first Palestinian uprising happened in 1936. Consequently, the British in 1937 decided to partition Palestine, to give a section, the one in the yellow on top, to the Jewish folks, the one in the red to the Arabs, and the green zone in the middle, which includes Bethlehem and Jerusalem, will continue to be under the British mandate. Well, both groups were not happy. The Jewish folks, they said, oh, there are still millions of Jews persecuted in Europe. We need to bring them, and we need the whole country, the yellow, the red, and also part of Transjordan. The Palestinians said, why would the British? This country does not belong to them. Why do they come to our land and make a line, in our country and give it to these new immigrants coming from Europe? Well, the British government was frustrated, and in 1948, they decided to give the problem of Palestine to the United Nations. This is what the UN did in 1947. 1947, the United Nations drew this map, and Palestine will be partitioned in this way. Everything in the yellow will become the proposed Jewish state. Everything in the red and with the lines will become the proposed Arab state. The United Nations carved Bethlehem and Jerusalem, and they decided they will be under the auspices of the United Nations. Well, the Arabs did not like the partition. They totally rejected it. They were the majority of the people. They continued to own about 2/3 of the country. They were very upset with the United Nations partition. You can see why. And so when Israel declared its independence in 1948, Arab countries had a war with Israel, and they not only lost what the United Nations gave to Israel, but also lost the red areas through war. And so what was left for the Arabs is the areas in lines, which is the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Next. These are important statistics. And we need to learn these statistics to understand why Palestinians and Arabs are very, very upset. In 1947, Palestinians owned approximately 87.5% of Palestine, while Jews owned 6.6% of the total land mass. The remaining 5.9% was state land as classified under the British mandate. So you can see Palestinians owned most of the land in 1947. The United Nations came and gave them less than half of their territory. And of course, it's natural for the Arabs to reject it. Next. All right, Ben-Gurion have this to say about the UN partition. Ben-Gurion became the first prime minister of the State of Israel. He said, after we become a strong force as the result of the creation of the state, we shall abolish partition, this is the UN partition, and expand to the whole of Palestine. So what did Ben-Gurion really want? I can't hear you. He wanted the whole thing, yes. And how did he want to do it? This is even more dangerous. Listen to what Ben-Gurion said. He said, we must use terror, assassination, intimidation, land confiscation, and the cutting of all social services to rid the Galilee of its Arab population. So it's not only that they had a goal on their mind, but also they have devised the means to fulfill that goal. Next. All right, by 1949, this became the map of Israel and Palestine. Everything now in the yellow became the Jewish state, the state of Israel. What was left for the Arabs is the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. The West Bank was taken over by Jordan. The Gaza Strip was taken over by by Egypt. What was left for the Palestinians? Nothing at all. Next. All right, Ben-Gurion was a smart man. Early on, as early as 1919, when my mother was only 3 years old, he recognized this. He said, there is no solution to this question, no solution. There is a gulf, and nothing can bridge it. We, as a nation, talking about the Jewish people, want this country to be ours. The Arabs, as a nation, want this country to be theirs. Ben-Gurion realized that if the Jews will come to the Holy Land, there will be a problem, and that problem will have no solution. And now we are living that problem. Next. So I call this a conflict of aspiration. Jewish aspirations, Arab aspirations, Muslim aspirations, Christian aspirations, all are gathering in this small strip of land. Next. Back to my family story. This church is in Jaffa. Jaffa is on the Mediterranean seashore. I show this church because my great-grandfather, Alexander Awad, made contribution to build this church. I'm trying to show the Christian connection with my family for so many years. If you go inside this church, you see this. It says in English, in the memory of the late Cavalier Alexander Bay Howard, beneficiary to this church. Of course, they translated Awad, that's my last name, to Howard. They made us British. But actually, if you read the Arabic, it says Awad, our Arabic name. But what I want to try to show you is that we Palestinian Christians have long roots in this country that go for many, many generations. As a matter of fact, you can go and visit that church today and see that writing on the wall. Next. Okay, back to my mother's story. Here is my mother when she was maybe in her late teens, and she was studying to be a nurse at the British Scottish Hospital in Nazareth. She found this handsome young man, and they got married and have 7 children, and I'm one of them. Next. Here's my father, Elias, with my oldest brother. His name is Nicola. Now he lives in Overland Park, Kansas, and he's 70 years old. Next. Well, our life in Jerusalem was normal life until we had what we call in Arabic the Nakba. The Nakba is an Arabic word that means catastrophe. And in 1948, we were living in West Jerusalem. I showed you our neighborhood, and it became a crossfire between the Israelis and the Jordanian army. My father, who was civilian, was shot and killed, leaving my mother with 7 children. The youngest was 6 months old, and the oldest was 11 years old, my brother Nicola. Few days after my father was shot, we were all forced out of our homes, and we became refugees. We have to leave West Jerusalem, where our home was, and we went to East Jerusalem. Next. Okay, not only us, but about 800,000 Palestinians became refugees. How did these people leave their homes? What made them leave their homes and go out and become refugees? There are many stories, but here is a witness of an Israeli soldier who participated in the 1948 Arab-Israeli war. He said, as uncontrolled panic spread through all Arab quarters, the Israelis brought up jeeps with loudspeakers which broadcast recorded horror sounds. These included shrieks, wails, and anguished moans of Arab women, the wail of sirens, and the clang of fire alarm bells, interrupted by sepulchre voice calling out in Arabic, "Save your souls, all ye faithful. The Jews are using poison gas and atomic weapons. Run for your lives in the name of Allah." Well, with this, of course, most Arabs, they got scared, and that with fear and panic, and also there were massacres happening in some of the villages like Deir Yassin, and that caused many of the Arabs to leave their homes and run away for safety. When they tried to come back to their homes, they were not able to. Many of their homes were destroyed anyway. Next. So, where did they go? They went to refugee camps set up by the Red Cross. The Red Cross gave them tents, and they went and lived in these tents for 10 years. Can you imagine? Leaving your house and living in a tent for 10 years until the United Nations came after 10 years and gave them cement and concrete and steel to try to build some small cottages for them. Next. It was miserable to live in a refugee camp, but this is what happened to 800,000 Palestinians after 1948. Next. This is the Haitian refugee camp, which is about 3 kilometers from here, and this picture was taken in 1959 when the United Nations came to try to help the Palestinians and gave them some concrete to replace the tents. Next. All of these dots are Palestinian towns and villages that were either destroyed or depopulated by the Israelis in 1948. Of course, destroyed means totally demolished. To depopulate a town, you surround it by 3 sides, and you leave one side open, and you give the people an ultimatum. You have 15 minutes. You get out. If you don't, we will destroy the town anyway. And so the bulk of the Palestinian population that were living in these over 400 villages and towns ran away. and left their homes. The Israelis then fortified their new borders where any a Palestinian man, woman, or child that tried to cross back to his or her home was shot and killed. And so the bulk of the Palestinian refugees stayed in refugee camps, many of them, unfortunately, until today. Well, the United Nations came with a beautiful resolution to try to help these Palestinian refugees. It's called Resolution 194. It says refugees wishing to return to their homes and live at peace with their neighbors should be permitted to do so at the earliest practicable date. And those wishing not to return should be compensated for their property. So what were the Palestinians offered? Either compensation or repatriation. But what did actually happen? Nothing, neither. This resolution was never implemented, and that's because of US pressure and using its veto against implementing these resolutions. Next. All right, back to my family story. My mother, in 1948, like I told you, she lost her husband, and she lost her home, she lost everything. We became refugees. We moved to East Jerusalem. We tried to find a new home. What did she do? She refused to go to a refugee camp. Instead, she decided to go to college. She went to Augusta Victoria School of Nursing in Jerusalem, and she became what we call a registered nurse. And she graduated as a registered nurse. She was a dedicated Christian woman, and instead of looking back at the tragedy, she decided to look forward. She always taught us, never harbor any anger in your heart, always forgive. Never look back, always look forward. Never say, why God, always say, how God. And with this attitude and with her deep Christian faith, she really helped us, her children. All right, here are the 8 of us, 7 children and my mother. And if you look from clockwise, I'm going from the top line, clockwise, that's my brother Mubarak on the extreme left, and then Bishara, the director of the Bible College, you probably met him, and then Elizabeth, then Ellen, then Diana. Diana, my sister, was 6 months old when my father was shot and killed. Then my mother, then Nicola, you saw his picture as a baby, and finally that's me. Sorry, I cannot move. All right. But, when we look at this picture, we just thank God. God has been merciful to us. The rest of the story is in my book, where God has really showed a lot of goodness and mercy to us through the years, especially with the help and the encouragement of a Christian mother. Next. Here are 2 of my brothers, Mubarak and Bishara, as students in one school. Next. Well, my mother could not have 7 children at home with her, so she put us in boarding schools. And so this is St. George's School in Jerusalem. It's a British school. And all of us 4 brothers would go and study during the day at St. George's School. But at night, we would go to our boarding orphanage, and we would live in the orphanage. And also my sisters went to other school because my mother had to work day and night to keep the family together. Next. But here again, by God's grace, we all grew up and we all, prospered in life. Some of us decided to go full-time ministry and serve God. Next. Here is my mother before she died, and she always had a smile on her face. And if you ask, Huda, why are you smiling? She will always put her hand up, and she would say, because of the goodness and the grace of God. She never remembered the negative. She always thought of the positive. Now we go back to the story of the Arab-Israeli conflict. What happened to the rest of the Palestinians? In 1967, we have another war called the Six-Day War. In the Six-Day War, Egypt lost the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip. Israel took the West Bank from Jordan and the Golan Heights from Syria. So a big problem became bigger, and the number of refugees even increased. Here is the West Bank. The West Bank is the big problem today. Israel wants the West Bank to be part of Greater Israel, while the Palestinians want the West Bank to be heart of their future state. In the West Bank lives around 3 million Palestinians, and about 400,000 Israeli settlers. And so the conflict today is really focusing on the West Bank. Okay, now talking about the West Bank, all of these colors within the West Bank, they are not lakes. We don't have too many lakes in the West Bank. These are Israeli settlements that were built since 1967. In my opinion, these settlements are the greatest obstacle to peace, because these settlements diminish the Palestinian aspiration of having a Palestinian state in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. All right, Israeli leaders encouraged their populations to grab the West Bank. Here's what Sharon had to say to his people. He said, everybody has to move, run and grab as many hilltops as they can to enlarge the settlements. Of course, these are the settlements in the West Bank. And then he said, because everything we take now will stay ours, the Jewish people. Everything we don't grab will go to them, of course, the Palestinians. That's Ariel Sharon. Next. All right, so the Palestinians did not stay idle, and they revolted, and the revolt is what we call intifada. The first intifada, 1987 to 1993, was mainly nonviolent. Palestinian men, women, and children went into the streets to say to the Israelis, enough is enough. We don't want you to take over our land. The Israelis responded with plastic bullets, with tear gas, and with live ammunition, and many Palestinians were killed in that uprising. But from the Palestinian perspective, it was not a violent uprising, while the second intifada was very violent. Next. The conclusion, the first intifada concluded with the peace process. We call it the Oslo Accords, and they were signed in the White House in 1993, with Yasser Arafat, Bill Clinton, and the Israeli Prime Minister Rabin. That was optimistic time, and everybody thought this is the end of the Arab-Israeli conflict and the start of a peace process. But unfortunately, it did not work out. Next. Why it didn't work out? Because